The panic room at Sterling Tower had a single working camera, and Isla Brennan was staring directly into it when the lights went out. She had been employed as a special needs teaching assistant at Westmount Academy for 6 years before the school board cut her position in a budget review. A Tuesday afternoon email, 3 lines, no severance. By the following Friday, her younger brother Callum's medical bills had stacked themselves into a tower on her kitchen table in Verdun, and the eviction notice had arrived tucked between a hydroquebec and a flyer for a pizza place that had already closed. She was 28 years old and completely out of road. The job listing had seemed almost too ordinary for what it turned out to be. Private household educational coordinator, immediate start, competitive compensation, discretion required. Isla had applied through an agency that asked very few questions and required a non-disclosure agreement before they would even tell her the employer's name. The employer was Nicholas Sterling. She had known the name the way everyone in Montreal knew the name. Plastered across 3 office towers downtown, attached to a development empire that had reshaped the waterfront and quietly owned half the hospitality sector in Quebec. What the newspapers did not print, and what Isla learned only in fragments over the first few weeks, was that Nicholas Sterling's business interests extended considerably further than commercial real estate. She had pieced it together from the men who stood at the foot of every staircase, from the encrypted calls he took at 2 in the morning, from the way conversations stopped the moment she walked into a room. She was not naive. She was desperate, and desperate was different. What none of it had prepared her for was Milo. Nicholas Sterling's son was 7 years old, non-verbal, and had not attended a single day of schooling since his mother had died 14 months ago. His previous 3 tutors had each lasted less than a week. The household staff spoke about him in quiet, careful voices, the way people speak about a wound that hasn't closed. He spent his days in the far east wing of the Sterling estate in Westmount, surrounded by towers of color-coded blocks that he arranged and rearranged with a silent, furious precision that no one had ever managed to interrupt without him dissolving into a state of complete distress. Isla had walked into Milo's room on her first morning, with no plan and no agenda, and sat on the floor 6 feet away from him, and done nothing at all. She had simply watched him work, her hands in her lap, breathing normally, making no demands on the air between them. He had ignored her for 40 minutes. Then, without looking up, he had slid a single yellow block across the hardwood floor in her direction. She had placed it carefully at the end of her own knee and left it there. He had watched it for a long moment from the corner of his eye. Then he had gone back to his towers, and Isla had felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched. That was how it started. Nicholas Sterling had watched the whole thing on the security monitor in his study. Isla hadn't known that then. She learned it later, from Gerald, his head of security, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s who delivered information with the measured brevity of someone who had long ago decided that most words were unnecessary. Mr. Sterling watched the feed for the full 40 minutes, Gerald told her, 3 days into her employment, when she had asked why her access code had been upgraded without notice. He doesn't watch anything for 40 minutes. Over the following 3 weeks, Milo began to change in ways that were almost too fragile to name. He started leaving his room during daylight hours. He began eating at the table in the kitchen rather than having his meals brought to him. He started carrying a small yellow block in his left hand at all times. Not the same block Isla had held, she noticed, but the same color, chosen with the same deliberate care. He still did not speak. But one morning he had appeared at the door of the room Isla used as a classroom, a large, sun-filled space she had reorganized entirely, removing the formal desk and replacing it with low tables, soft cushions, a sand tray, shelves of objects arranged by texture, and he had walked in of his own accord and sat down. Isla had had to excuse herself to the hallway for 30 seconds to collect herself before she could continue. Nicholas came to find her that evening. She had been in the estate's library, marking notes in the communication journal she kept for Milo when the door opened and he stepped inside. She had seen him at a distance in the preceding weeks, in corridors, crossing the courtyard, once through the window of his study where he stood at the glass in a dark suit watching something in the garden below with an expression she couldn't read. Up close, he was quieter than she had expected. The newspapers tended to photograph him in motion, arriving at events or departing them, always slightly ahead of the frame. In person, he had the stillness of someone who had long ago learned that the room would orient around him whether he moved or not. He carried that block to breakfast, Nicholas said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her. He did not sit with any particular ceremony. He sat the way men sit when they are very tired and have stopped pretending otherwise. He has not voluntarily come to the table for breakfast in 14 months. He's been ready, Isla said carefully. He just needed somewhere safe to land. Nicholas looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention that she had already begun to recognize. Not inspection, exactly, but a kind of serious consideration, as if he were calibrating something internal. What do you need, he said, to keep doing what you're doing? A sand table with backlighting. Better noise cancelling for the east windows. There's a delivery bay at the end of the block that starts at 6:30 in the morning, and I can see it disrupts him, and I'd like permission to take him outside. Not far. Just the garden to start. He needs to learn that the world past his room isn't something to survive. Nicholas nodded once, looking down at the table. Then he said, without particular inflection, his mother used to take him to the garden. A pause, before. Isla did not fill the silence. She had learned, with children who could not speak, that silence was not empty. It was often the only honest thing in the room. The sand table will be there tomorrow morning, Nicholas said, standing. The windows will be done by Friday. He paused at the door. Thank you, Miss Brennan. She did not tell him that she would have done it for a fraction of the salary, just to watch Milo Sterling walk into a room of his own choosing. Some things were not information that needed to be shared. The trouble began, as troubles so often do, from a direction she had not been watching. Rosalie Fontaine was Nicholas's sister-in-law, his late wife Celeste's older sister, and she arrived at the estate on a Thursday afternoon in late October wearing a camel coat and a practiced expression of warm concern that did not reach her eyes. Isla passed her in the entrance hall and felt, with the instinct of someone who had spent years reading the unspoken communications of children who had no other language, that something in the woman's careful smile was calculating rather than kind. Rosalie requested a visit with Milo. Nicholas, who was in Ottawa for a board meeting and not expected back until evening, had left Gerald in charge of household management. Gerald had allowed the visit. Isla was not informed. She found out because Milo came to find her. He appeared in the doorway of the classroom at a time when he was supposed to be resting. His face pale, one hand pressed flat against his sternum in the gesture she had learned, meant something was wrong with the air in a room, that something had shifted in a way his body registered before his mind could process it. He was clutching the yellow block so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Isla crossed the room immediately, crouching to his level. She did not touch him without permission. She never did. But she placed her open hand on the floor between them, palm up, the way she always did when she was asking a question without words. He placed the yellow block in her palm and looked at the door. She understood. Show me, she said quietly. He led her down the corridor toward the informal sitting room near the east wing. Through the half-open door, Isla could hear Rosalie speaking on her phone in rapid, low French that she clearly did not expect anyone to overhear. Isla's French was considerably better than her employment file suggested. She had grown up in Saint Laurent, in a household where 3 languages moved through the kitchen simultaneously. Il va mieux, Rosalie was saying. Oui, beaucoup mieux. L'éducatrice a réussi là où les autres ont échoué. A pause. She turned toward the window, and Isla caught only fragments. Si l'enfant est stable, il sera plus difficile de contester. And then, clearly and without any attempt at concealment, because she assumed no one was listening, 18 mois, maximum, s'il continue à progresser, le rapport du tribunal sera positif. Et s'il est positif, je ne verrai jamais la couleur de cet argent. Isla stood very still in the corridor. The estate, the trust tied to Celeste Sterling's estate, which Rosalie had contested in court on the grounds that Milo was not capable of benefiting from it, would resolve in Rosalie's favor only if the court-appointed assessment determined that Milo's developmental needs could not be adequately met within his current environment. A child who was improving, who was stable, who was being reached. That child undermined Rosalie's legal position entirely. Milo was not a tragedy to be leveraged. He was an obstacle to a financial settlement. The realization settled into Isla's body like cold water. She took Milo back to the classroom. She set up the sand tray, a calming activity, low demand, just the sensation of the sand and the small, smooth stones she had sourced from a sensory supplier in Vancouver. And she sat across from him and kept her breathing even, because he would feel her distress before she showed it, and she refused to make him carry her fear. When Gerald appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later to inform her that Miss Fontaine had left the premises, Isla nodded pleasantly and waited until Gerald's footsteps had receded down the hall. Then she took out her phone and documented everything she had heard, time-stamped in the notes application, and emailed it to herself. That evening, she requested an urgent meeting with Nicholas. He arrived home at 7:30 and came directly to the library without stopping to change. He still had his coat on when he walked in. Isla noticed that this was, in her experience of him, unusual. Nicholas Sterling tended to arrive at conversations with everything settled and composed, as though the process of arriving had already been handled somewhere else. Tonight, he looked like a man who had been managing difficult things at a distance and suspected he was about to manage something more difficult up close. She told him what she had heard. She read him the notes directly from her phone because she did not want to risk misremembering the phrasing. She was precise and factual and did not editorialize because she had learned from years of writing professional reports about children that emotion was information but it was not evidence, and right now she needed him to hear evidence. Nicholas was very still through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How much of that is admissible?" "I'm not a lawyer," Isla said. "But she was in your house, on your property, and I didn't enter the room. I was in the corridor. In Quebec, depending on the circumstances, I'll have my legal team assess it by morning." He stood walking to the window. Outside, the garden was dark, the maples stripped down by October. "She's been challenging the trust since before Celeste's funeral. I knew it was ongoing. I didn't know she was." He stopped. "I didn't know she had connected it to Milo's progress. She has a court-appointed assessor reviewing his file. If he improves significantly, her argument that the trust environment is inadequate collapses, so my son getting better is a legal liability for her. Yes, the word sat between them for a moment, doing its quiet damage. "Milo came to get you," Nicholas said. He turned from the window. In the lamplight, he looked briefly, like a man who was tired in a way that sleep didn't touch. "He came to find you when something felt wrong. He did. He has not sought out another person in this house since Celeste had died." Nicholas looked at her steadily. "Not once. Not Gerald. Not the housekeeper who has been here for 9 years. No one." Isla did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which was a thing she had learned was often more useful. "Whatever Rosalie is trying to do," Nicholas said quietly, "she is not going to use my son as an instrument of it, and I am not going to let her dismantle what you've built with him." A pause. "What do you need?" "To protect him from this documentation," Isla said. "Everything I do with him, every session, every milestone. Detailed, dated, professionally formatted. If there's an assessment, I want there to be a paper trail so thorough that no evaluator can dismiss it." She hesitated. "And I'd like to consult with a developmental specialist, someone independent, not connected to your network. Someone whose endorsement means something because it can't be bought." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense at the implication, she thought, but something closer to respect for the directness of it. "I'll arrange it. Any other requirements?" "One more thing," Isla said. "I think Milo should have more consistent exposure to the garden, daily, weather permitting, being in a broader environment, demonstrating adaptive behavior outside a controlled setting. That will matter for any assessment." Nicholas nodded. "Then he showed me your notes. He brought them to my study last week." A small pause. "The ones you leave for him in the sand tray. The little drawings." Isla felt something warm move through her chest. She had started leaving small pressed images in the sand. A bird, a leaf, a simple house, for Milo to find in the mornings, a way of starting a dialogue without requiring speech. She hadn't known he had taken them anywhere. "He put them in the drawer of his bedside table," Nicholas said. "Gerald noticed when he was changing the linens." Isla pressed her lips together briefly. "He's building a collection," she said, and her voice came out slightly uneven, which she hadn't intended. "He's organizing the world. That's a very good sign." "I know," Nicholas said quietly, and the word landed differently than she expected, softer and more personal, as though he were not speaking about the assessment at all. The weeks that followed were careful and deliberate. Isla documented everything. The developmental specialist she requested, a woman from the University of Toronto who had published extensively on nonverbal children and attachment repair, came and observed Milo for an afternoon and wrote a preliminary report that used words like significant, consistent, and unprecedented progress that Isla read 4 times in the privacy of her own room before she allowed herself to believe them. Milo began doing something new. When Isla arrived each morning and sat on the floor of the classroom with her open hand on the boards between them, he began coming to sit beside her, not across from her, but beside, his shoulder almost touching hers, their hands both resting in the sand tray. He would not look at her directly, but he leaned almost imperceptibly toward the warmth of her. She did not draw attention to it. She just stayed still and let him have the choice of it. Nicholas began arriving earlier in the evenings. She noticed it without remarking on it. He would appear in the doorway of the classroom and observe the last 20 minutes of her session with Milo, leaning against the doorframe in his suit, loosened tie, watching with that particular quality of stillness she had come to recognize as his version of being moved by something. He never interrupted. When the session ended and Milo padded off toward the kitchen, Nicholas would come the rest of the way into the room and they would talk. About Milo, at first, always about Milo, and then gradually, inevitably, about other things. Her brother Callum's recovery, his late wife's garden and who had planted which roses, the difficulty of knowing what to hold on to and what to let go. Things that happen naturally, the way warmth spreads from a source you are standing close to long enough. She was not unaware of the imbalance of it. He was her employer. The power differential was real, and she did not pretend otherwise. She kept herself at the edge of those evenings, professional and careful, because she owed Milo that much, and because she was not a woman who let herself want things that could complicate her ability to do her job. She had spent 6 years learning to keep her own needs at the outer edge of a room so that a child's needs could occupy the center. But she was also human, and Nicholas Sterling, stripped of the newspaper photographs and the granite boardroom reputation, was a man who listened with his whole attention, who was visibly undone by his son's smallest victories, who had been quietly carrying a grief that he had never allowed to slow him down because slowing down had felt, she suspected, like a form of failing the child he had left to raise. She understood that. She understood it in a way that had nothing to do with professional training. The night it broke open was a Thursday in November, 6 weeks after Isla had overheard Rosalie in the sitting room. Gerald came to find her at 10:30 in the evening, when she was in the kitchen making tea. He was moving quickly, which she had never seen him do, and his face was carrying something she could not immediately name. "Mr. Sterling needs you in the East Wing," Gerald said. "Now." She followed him down the corridor at a near run and understood why when she heard it. A sound she had not heard Milo make before, a sustained, low, distressed vocalization that meant something was very wrong. His door was open. He was sitting in the corner of his room between his bed and the wall, knees drawn up, rocking, the yellow block pressed to his lips. His face was wet. Nicholas was crouched a few feet from him, speaking quietly and carefully, not demanding anything, doing everything right. But Milo was not registering him. Isla went straight to the floor. She did not speak. She sat cross-legged 3 feet from Milo and put her open hand on the boards between them, palm up, and waited. It took 4 minutes. She knew because she counted her own breaths. Then Milo's hand moved from his own lap and he placed the yellow block in her palm. The rocking slowed, his breathing began to even out. Nicholas sat back against the wall. He looked like a man who had been underwater and had just broken the surface. Later, when Isla had sat with him until his breathing had deepened and evened out, and the yellow block was back in his small, curled fist, she found Nicholas in the corridor. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, staring at nothing. "What happened?" "Rosalie sent someone," Nicholas said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. "A woman from the court assessor's office." Unannounced, Gerald wasn't delivery mix-up, and one of the newer staff let her in. She went directly to his wing before anyone realized. She wanted to observe him in an unmanaged environment. He paused. She walked into his rise for 1 second. He would have experienced that as a complete rupture in safety. He went into crisis within 30 seconds of her entering the room. She panicked and left. "That's when Gerald came to get you." "He came out of it," Isla said. "He regulated. He let me help him regulate." Nicholas, that's actually significant. 6 weeks ago, he wouldn't have been able to do that." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was open in a way she had not seen it before. Not the careful, managed openness of their evening conversations, but something rawer and less prepared. "You walked into that room," he said, "and you sat on the floor, and you held out your hand, and he came back." "He came back. And that's what we've been building." "I know." A pause. I have never been able to do that. In 14 months, I have not been able to do what you did in 4 minutes. His voice was quiet and entirely without self-pity, which somehow made it harder to hear. "He's my son. And you are the person he goes to." "He goes to both of us now," Isla said carefully. "In different ways." Nicholas shook his head slightly. "Don't soften it. I'm not softening it. I'm being accurate." She took a breath. "He showed you the drawings. He put them in the drawer beside his bed so they'd be there when he woke up, and then he walked them to your study because he wanted you to see them. That's not the action of a child who is indifferent to his father." She looked at him steadily. "He is working his way toward you. He just needed somewhere safe to start." The same words she had used on her second evening in the library about the garden. Nicholas looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no easy language for. Then he said very quietly, "Where did you come from, Isla?" She almost laughed. "Saint Laurent," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him that wasn't performed for someone else's benefit. The legal confrontation came 10 days later, in a formal meeting at a downtown law office that Isla attended as a professional witness at Nicholas's request. She had spent the intervening days organizing her documentation into a package that she privately thought was the most thorough work of her professional life. Session notes, developmental milestones, photographic evidence of Milo's voluntary engagement, the University of Toronto specialist's preliminary assessment, and a timeline of Milo's progress laid out in clear, clinical language that left no room for misinterpretation. Rosalie Fontaine entered the boardroom in the same camel coat. She looked briefly at Isla with an expression of mild surprise, as though she had not expected the teaching assistant to be seated at the table rather than waiting in a corridor somewhere. Isla met her gaze pleasantly and did not look away first. The recording, legal counsel had confirmed its admissibility under provincial law given the circumstances, was played in the first 20 minutes of the meeting. The room became very quiet. Rosalie's lawyer requested several recesses. Rosalie herself maintained, through all of it, a composure that Isla found more revealing than distress would have been. It was the composure of someone who had known the risk and accepted it when she decided to move forward anyway. Nicholas said almost nothing during the meeting. He had legal counsel for the speaking. He sat at the head of the table in a dark suit and watched Rosalie across the conference table with the particular stillness that Isla had come to understand was not absence but its precise opposite. A full, cold, comprehensive attention that she suspected had closed many difficult rooms in his career. When the session recordings and the University of Toronto assessment were entered into the record and Rosalie's counsel began, haltingly, to discuss the possibility of withdrawal, Nicholas's expression did not change by a degree. Afterward, in the elevator going down, he stood beside her and said nothing for 4 floors. Then, you built an entire legal case out of sand trays and yellow blocks. I built a record of your son's capacity. Isla said the legal case built itself. The doors opened at the lobby. He held them for a moment, looking at her. This evening. Not a working dinner. Just dinner. She thought of the 100 reasons that was complicated. She thought of Callum getting better. She thought of Milo and the yellow block and the drawer beside his bed full of drawings. All right, she said. Milo was waiting for them when they got back to the estate. He was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, not in his room, not in the east wing, but right there in the entrance hall, yellow block in hand. When Isla pushed open the door and came inside, he looked up. Then he stood up, walked directly to her, and pressed the yellow block into her hand. It was the first time he had initiated contact without her open palm invitation. Isla's breath caught somewhere in her throat. She crouched down to his level and looked at him. Not at his ear, not at a neutral middle distance the way you were sometimes advised to look at children who found direct gaze difficult, but at his face, because in that moment, she could not look anywhere else. Directly, for a full 3 seconds. Then he turned and looked at his father, and then back at her, and something in his expression, in the soft, exhausted, serious face of this small boy who had been carrying more than small boys should ever have to carry, shifted into something that did not have a clinical term, but that every person who has ever loved a child in crisis would have recognized immediately. He was satisfied. He was home. Nicholas crouched down beside her. He rested his hand on Milo's shoulder, not gripping, just present, and Milo did not pull away. "Hey, buddy," Nicholas said quietly. Milo pressed his shoulder slightly into his father's hand, just slightly. The smallest possible gesture in the direction of something that had been closed for 14 months. Isla pressed her lips together and looked at the floor tiles for a moment, blinking. "He's been waiting," Gerald said from the hallway, and his voice was the most emotional she had ever heard it, which wasn't very emotional at all, but from Gerald meant considerable. That evening, after a dinner in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, just the kitchen table, with Milo present and drawing in his notebook while the adults ate. Nicholas walked her to the library for a glass of wine that stretched into 2 hours of conversation that moved through Celeste and Callum and Westmount and Saint Laurent, and things that had no category other than the general territory of who 2 people actually were beneath the circumstances that had brought them together. At the door to the library, when the evening had gone late and the house had settled into quiet, he said, "I was not looking for anything. Neither was I," she said honestly, and yet. He looked at her with the full weight of that attention. "Here we are." "Here we are," she agreed. He leaned down and kissed her, once in the manner of someone making a decision that has been quietly made for longer than either party has admitted. It tasted like the wine and like something steadier beneath it. In the morning, Milo appeared at the classroom door at 7:45, with his notebook tucked under one arm and the yellow block in his left hand. He came inside without waiting to be invited. He sat beside Isla at the low table, set his block down precisely between them, and opened his notebook to a new page. At the top, in careful, deliberately formed letters that took her breath away, He had written 2 words. "Stay, Isla." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she picked up a pencil and wrote underneath, "I'm staying." She slid the notebook back to him. He read it. He picked up the yellow block and held it, the way he always held it when something felt settled and right, and then he turned to a fresh page and began to draw. Outside, the November sun came through the east windows at an angle that made the whole room gold.